Doctors, what's the biggest medical myth people still believe? Story 1. Your blood is not blue when it's low on oxygen. Okay, so this one drives me absolutely insane, and I hear it constantly. People look at their veins, those blue-green lines on the inside of your wrist, and they go, "Oh yeah, that's because deoxygenated blood is blue." No, stop. Your blood is never blue. Not once in your life has your blood been blue. Not for a single second. Here's what's actually happening. Blood that's carrying oxygen is bright red. Blood that's returned the oxygen to your tissues and is heading back to the lungs is a darker red, more of a deep crimson. That's it. The spectrum goes from cherry red to dark red. Blue is not in the game at all. So why do your veins look blue or green through your skin? It's a light absorption thing. Different wavelengths of light penetrate skin to different depths. Red and orange light gets absorbed by the tissue before it reaches the vein. The light that bounces back to your eye from the area around the vein is more blue-green. Your brain then does something called simultaneous color contrast, basically comparing the reflected light from the vein against the surrounding skin tone, and interprets it as blue. You're essentially being tricked by your own visual processing system. The only animal that actually has blue blood is the horseshoe crab, and that's because their blood uses copper-based hemocyanin instead of iron-based hemoglobin to carry oxygen. And even then, it's only blue when it's oxygenated. So if you were going to use the blue blood argument, you'd have it backwards for the one animal where it actually applies. If your blood were genuinely blue inside your veins and turned red the moment it hit oxygen, every surgery ever performed would look like a Smurf movie for the first few seconds. It doesn't, because the blood is red. The blood has always been red. Please tell your friends. Story 2. Seeds don't cause diverticulitis flares, and doctors have been telling patients this forever. For decades, genuinely for decades, patients with diverticulitis were told to avoid seeds, nuts, corn, and popcorn. The logic seemed to make intuitive sense. You have these little pouches in your colon called diverticula. Seeds are small and hard. Therefore, seeds get stuck in the pouches and cause inflammation. Case closed, right? Except no one actually studied this until 2008, when a paper came out in JAMA following over 47,000 men for 18 years, specifically tracking nut, corn, and popcorn consumption in relation to diverticulitis episodes. The result? No association. None. Men who ate these foods the most were not more likely to have flares. If anything, there was a slight trend in the opposite direction. The seeds cause flares belief was just a plausible story that got repeated so many times it became clinical gospel. Doctors told patients, patients told each other. It ended up in patient education handouts, and nobody stopped to check whether it was actually true. This is genuinely embarrassing for the field, and most gastroenterologists have now updated their guidance. But there are still physicians out there scaring diverticulitis patients away from strawberries and sesame seeds based on zero evidence. What actually causes flares is much less satisfying as a narrative. It's a combination of gut microbiome changes, chronic low-grade inflammation, and probably diet in a much more general sense. Low fiber intake seems to be a real risk factor for developing diverticula in the first place. But eat more fiber and your gut bacteria need to be in good shape doesn't have the same satisfying mechanical clarity as a sesame seed got stuck. The restricted seed diet caused a lot of unnecessary dietary misery for a lot of people for a very long time. The myth is still out there. If someone tells you to avoid seeds for your diverticulitis, ask them when they last looked at the evidence. Story 3. Calling an ambulance does not skip you to the front of the ER line. I cannot tell you how many times I've seen this play out in the emergency department. Someone has been waiting in the waiting room for 2 hours, decides this is taking too long, leaves, calls 911, gets brought back in an ambulance, and genuinely expects to be triaged differently. They will then be furious, genuinely furious, when they end up back in the same waiting area they just left. Here's how triage actually works. You are seen in order of how sick you are, not in order of how you arrived. When you come in by ambulance, the paramedics hand you off to the nursing staff who do a triage assessment. If your chief complaint is a sprained ankle or a headache that's been going on for 3 days, you are going to the waiting room. The ambulance did not change your acuity. It changed your mode of transport and cost you several hundred to several $1,000s, depending on your insurance situation. The patients who get seen immediately from an ambulance are the ones arriving in cardiac arrest, having active strokes, with trauma, with sepsis, with respiratory failure. They get seen immediately because they are dying. The ambulance communicated that to the ED before arrival, and a team was ready. That is why it looks like ambulance patients go straight back, because the ones you notice going straight back are the ones who would die in the waiting room. The bonus misconception here is that people genuinely believe the ambulance will take them home afterward. It will not. The ambulance is a one-way medical transport to the hospital. You will need to arrange your own way home, whether that is a family member, a rideshare, or a taxi. This comes as a shock to a surprising number of people who have apparently never thought through the logistics of what an ambulance actually is for. Story 4. Tetanus has nothing to do with rust. Any dirty wound can give it to you. The rusty nail thing is one of those medical myths that has been so thoroughly absorbed into popular culture that it's basically its own meme at this point. Step on a rusty nail? Tetanus shot time. Get cut by a rusty fence? Rush to urgent care. But get cut by a non-rusty knife that's been sitting in your garden? Probably fine, right? Wrong. Completely wrong. Rust has nothing to do with tetanus. Tetanus is caused by a bacterium called Clostridium tetani, which produces a neurotoxin that causes the characteristic muscle spasms, including the locked jaw, that gives the disease its common name. C. Tetani lives in soil, in animal manure, in dust, and on surfaces that have been in contact with these things. It particularly thrives in anaerobic conditions, environments without oxygen, which is why deep puncture wounds are higher risk than shallow cuts. The wound provides a low oxygen pocket where the bacteria can proliferate and produce toxins. Rust itself is just iron oxide. It is not toxic, and it does not contain or harbor Clostridium tetani any more than any other surface that's been in contact with soil would. The reason rusty nails got associated with tetanus is probably that rusty nails are typically old nails found outside in the dirt, and dirt is where the bacteria actually live. The rust is a marker for the conditions that make tetanus transmission more likely, not the cause of it. A clean knife that hasn't touched soil or animal matter is genuinely lower risk than a rusty nail. But a clean kitchen knife that's fallen on garden soil, or any puncture wound sustained outdoors, absolutely warrants thinking about your tetanus vaccination status. The question isn't whether the metal is rusty. The question is whether the wound was contaminated with soil or organic matter. Please update your mental model. Story 5. That hip pain you have probably isn't bursitis, and your doctor might not know that. So this one is a bit of an inside baseball medical thing, but it matters a lot for the people who have this condition. So stay with me. Lateral hip pain, the aching on the outside of your hip that makes it impossible to lie on your side, and hurts when you walk upstairs, has been called trochanteric bursitis for decades. The bursa is a small, fluid-filled sac near the hip that can become inflamed. The diagnosis made intuitive, anatomical sense, and the name stuck. Multiple well-designed papers starting in the early 2000s showed that when you actually look at what's happening in the tissue of people with this pain, using ultrasound imaging and biopsies, the bursa is usually fine. What's actually going on is damage to the gluteal tendons that insert at the greater trochanter. The tendons are torn, degenerated, or both. This is a tendinopathy, not a bursitis. And the distinction matters enormously for treatment. Bursitis and tendinopathy respond to different things. Corticosteroid injections, which were the standard treatment for bursitis, provide some short-term pain relief but can actually worsen tendon integrity with repeated use. Tendinopathy responds much better to progressive loading exercises, particularly eccentric strengthening of the gluteal muscles. The treatment that was being given for decades, based on the wrong diagnosis, was at best inadequate, and at worst, actively making the tendon worse. Also, and this is a detail that even specialists get wrong, the best imaging for this condition is ultrasound, not MRI. Ultrasound lets you do dynamic assessment and is more sensitive for detecting tendon pathology at this particular site. Most people get an MRI because that's what gets ordered for hip pain, and the report might not even catch the tendon pathology clearly. If you have lateral hip pain and someone calls it bursitis without any hesitation, it might be worth a second opinion. Story 6, getting sick, does not train your immune system. It's actually the opposite. This one has such intuitive appeal that even people who should know better believe it. The idea is basically, illness is like a workout for your immune system. You get exposed, you suffer, you recover, you come out stronger. It feels like it should be true. It maps onto how muscles work, how stress inoculation works, how building tolerance to allergens works. It feels right. It's not right, at least not in the way people think. Here's the actual immunology. Immunological memory, the mechanism that protects you from getting the same disease twice, is narrowly targeted. Your immune system learns to recognize the specific pathogen you encountered. That's it. It doesn't become generally more capable or more vigilant. It has one more entry in a very specific filing system. And that memory doesn't even last forever for many pathogens. Immunity to some infections wanes substantially over years. More importantly, a lot of infections actively suppress your immune system while you're sick. Measles is one of the most devastating examples. The measles virus destroys a significant proportion of your existing immunological memory, wiping out protection you'd built up against completely unrelated pathogens. Children who get measles can end up more vulnerable to other infections for years afterward. This is called immune amnesia, and it is the exact opposite of the immune workout narrative. Then there are the post-infectious syndromes, long COVID being the most recent and most visible example, but Epstein-Barr virus has been linked to multiple sclerosis. Certain infections trigger autoimmune conditions, and the list goes on. These aren't rare edge cases. They're reasonably common downstream effects of infections that people who believe illness makes you stronger tend to not factor in. Vaccines give you the immunological memory without any of this. They are genuinely the workout without the injury risk. The myth that getting sick is somehow more authentic or more beneficial than vaccination is not just wrong, it's backwards. Story 7. I feel fine is one of the most dangerous sentences in medicine. I cannot count the number of times I have had this conversation. The patient comes in, we check their blood pressure, it is 180/110, which is, to be very clear, a medical emergency range. I express appropriate concern. The patient says, "But I feel totally fine." I will try to explain. The patient says again, with more confidence, "I've always had high blood pressure, and I've always been fine." This is the core of a genuinely dangerous misconception about how the body works. People assume that if something is wrong with them, they will feel it. Those symptoms are the body's early warning system, and the absence of symptoms means the absence of a problem. For acute injuries and infections, this is often roughly true. For chronic diseases, it is catastrophically false. Hypertension is called the silent killer for exactly this reason. Blood pressure of 180 over 110 feels like blood pressure of 120 over 80 because you adapted to it gradually and because hypertension's damage is cumulative and internal. It is quietly destroying your blood vessels, straining your heart, damaging your kidneys, and increasing your stroke risk every single day, with zero symptoms until the stroke happens or the kidney failure is caught on a blood test or the heart gives out. The same is true for type 2 diabetes. An A1C of 14%, which represents an average blood glucose of approximately 350 milligrams per deciliter, is causing nerve damage, microvascular destruction in the eyes and kidneys, and dramatically accelerated cardiovascular disease. People with chronically elevated blood sugar often report feeling fine because they adapted to it. The damage is happening anyway. The symptoms of the damage, neuropathy, vision loss, kidney failure, come later when reversing the damage is much harder. Feeling fine is not the same thing as being fine. Screening exists for exactly this reason. If you haven't had your blood pressure or blood work checked in a while, please go get checked. Story 8. The 10% brain myth, left/right brain dominance. And the hippocampus isn't a memory bank. Let's do a triple header of neuroscience myths that won't die, starting with the granddaddy of them all. You only use 10% of your brain. Nobody knows where this came from with certainty. It's been attributed to Einstein, no evidence he said it, to early neuroscience misquotes, and to self-help culture that needed a hook for the idea that you have untapped potential. Regardless of origin, it is completely false. Your brain uses virtually all of itself, just not all simultaneously for the same task. Different regions activate for different functions, and the brain is metabolically extremely expensive. It uses about 20% of your body's energy, despite being 2% of your body weight. Evolution does not maintain expensive tissue that isn't being used. Neuroimaging studies show that essentially all brain regions are active over the course of a day. The 10% figure has no basis in neuroscience whatsoever. Left brain/right brain dominance is a more nuanced myth because there is genuine hemispheric specialization. Language tends to be left lateralized in most right-handed people, for example. But the popular version, where you're either a creative right brain person or a logical left brain person, is fiction. A large 2013 study looking at over 1,000 people found no evidence of individuals having a dominant brain network in either hemisphere. The brain works as an integrated system with the two hemispheres communicating constantly via the corpus callosum. And finally, the hippocampus does not store memories. This is a subtle but important distinction. The hippocampus consolidates memories. It takes new information and processes it for long-term storage distributed across the cortex. Damage to the hippocampus, as in severe Alzheimer's disease, impairs the formation of new memories but does not erase all existing memories because those memories aren't in the hippocampus. They're distributed throughout the cortex. The hippocampus is the librarian, not the library. Story 9. Wearing glasses does not make your eyes weaker. Please stop saying this. This comes up constantly in optometry, And it is one of those myths that is so persistent that patients will argue with you about it while you're literally the person who went to school for this. The belief is that wearing glasses creates a dependency, that your eyes get lazy from relying on the correction, and that if you just pushed through the blurry vision and let your eyes work harder, they'd improve on their own. This is not how eyes work at all. Myopia, nearsightedness, hyperopia, farsightedness, and astigmatism are primarily structural issues with the eye, specifically the relationship between the length of the eyeball and the focusing power of the cornea and lens. A myopic eye is typically too long, so light focuses in front of the retina rather than on it. Glasses correct for this by adjusting where the light converges before it enters the eye. They do not change the structure of the eye, they do not affect the muscles controlling the eye, and they do not cause the eye to forget how to focus. What does happen, and this is probably where the myth comes from, is that once you have correction and your brain gets used to seeing clearly, the blur without correction feels more noticeable than it did before you had glasses. Your brain recalibrated its standard for acceptable vision. This is not your eyes getting weaker. This is your brain updating its baseline after experiencing what good vision actually feels like. The same myth sometimes manifests as people deliberately wearing weaker prescriptions than they need because they heard it's better for your eyes. It is not better for your eyes. It causes eye strain, headaches, and fatigue. Wear your actual prescription. Your optometrist gave you that number for a reason. Story 10. Onions on your feet and egg cleansing, folk medicine that refuses to die. So there's a whole ecosystem of folk medical remedies that sit in this interesting space between harmless cultural tradition and genuinely concerning medical misinformation. And two of the ones I run into most often in certain Texas communities are the onion on the feet thing and huevo limpia, egg cleansing. The onion feet belief holds that placing sliced onions on the soles of your feet and sleeping with them there overnight will draw toxins out of your body and help you recover from illness faster. There is a version of this that goes through specific meridian points in the feet. There is no evidence for any of this. Onions do not absorb toxins through skin. There are no meridian pathways in the feet that connect to your organs in the way this tradition describes. The onion will smell, and you will have orange feet in the morning, and that is the extent of what will happen. Huevo limpia, rubbing an egg over a sick person's body, and then cracking the egg into water to read what the illness or bad energy is a curanderismo practice with deep cultural roots in Mexican and Mexican-American communities. If the egg white looks cloudy or has a strange shape in the water, it is taken as confirmation of illness or spiritual disturbance. The problem is that fresh eggs cracked into water produce cloudy whites and variable shapes by default. There's nothing being read there that isn't random variation in protein structure. These beliefs are genuinely not harming anyone in isolation. An onion on your foot won't hurt you, and neither will a cleansing ritual. The concern is when these practices substitute for or delay actual medical care for conditions that need it. At that point, cultural tradition intersects with medical risk in ways that are worth being honest about. Story: 1198.6 is not normal temperature, and 99 is probably not a fever for you. The 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, 37 degrees Celsius figure comes from a study by German physician Karl Wunderlich, published in 1851. He measured axillary, armpit temperatures in about 25,000 patients and calculated a mean. The methodology would not pass a modern review. The thermometers of the era weren't particularly precise. Armpit temperature runs lower than oral or rectal temperature, and the sample had its own biases. But 98.6 entered the textbooks and has lived there ever since. A large 2020 Stanford study looking at temperature data from the Civil War era to the present found that average human body temperature has actually been declining over time and currently sits closer to 97.9 degrees Fahrenheit, 36.6 degrees Celsius. The proposed explanation is that baseline levels of inflammation in the population have decreased as infectious disease burden has fallen, and lower inflammation means lower baseline temperature. Normal body temperature also varies meaningfully between individuals at different times of day, lower in the morning, higher in the late afternoon. Across the menstrual cycle, with age, older adults tend to run cooler, and with activity level, saying your normal is exactly 98.6 is like saying your normal resting heart rate is exactly 72. It might be, but there's a wide range of normal. Now for the 99 is a fever for me thing. Here's the nuance. If your personal baseline genuinely runs lower, say 97.5, then 99 might represent a genuine elevation of similar magnitude to a 100.4 reading in someone with a 98.6 baseline. But the way this claim gets deployed is often by people who don't know their actual baseline and are using "I feel sick" as the definition of fever, rather than actual temperature elevation. Fever has a definition: over 38 degrees Celsius, 100.4 degrees Fahrenheit, by oral measurement. Below that threshold, you can be sick with an infection, but it's not a fever. The distinction matters clinically. Story 12. You don't have to be old or fat to have sleep apnea, and missing it can kill you. The mental image most people have of sleep apnea is the overweight middle-aged man who snores like a chainsaw and falls asleep at red lights. And yes, that profile is real, and that person absolutely should be tested. But the assumption that you have to fit that description to have sleep apnea is genuinely dangerous because it means that the people who don't fit the profile never get evaluated. Pediatric sleep apnea is real and relatively common, often caused by enlarged tonsils and adenoids in children whose anatomy is simply not yet proportioned to keep their airway open during sleep. Kids with sleep apnea often don't snore loudly. They might mouth breathe, have behavioral problems, do poorly in school, or wet the bed. These are not obviously respiratory symptoms, which is why the diagnosis gets missed. Young, lean athletes can have sleep apnea caused by craniofacial anatomy, the position of the jaw, the width of the palate, tongue size relative to the oral cavity. None of these have anything to do with body weight. A competitive marathon runner with a narrow airway can have severe obstructive sleep apnea. Their fitness actually makes the cardiovascular consequences harder to detect early because their heart can compensate more before showing signs of strain. This matters because untreated sleep apnea is genuinely bad for you. The repeated oxygen desaturations stress the cardiovascular system, increase blood pressure, increase risk of cardiac arrhythmia, and are associated with significantly increased risk of heart attack and stroke. The connection between sleep apnea and sudden cardiac death exists and is not trivial. If you snore, wake up unrefreshed, have morning headaches, or feel chronically fatigued regardless of how much you sleep, please ask your doctor about a sleep study. It's not just for heavy sleepers with thick necks. Story 13. IgE/NEX chronic Lyme tests are predatory medicine and the victims are real patients in real pain. Okay, let me be very precise here, because this is a topic where nuance gets lost and real people with real suffering get caught in the middle. Here is what is true. Lyme disease exists. It is a real bacterial infection transmitted by tick bites. It can be serious if untreated, and some people do experience persistent symptoms after standard antibiotic treatment. Here is what is also true. IGeneX is a commercial laboratory that uses testing methods that are not validated by standard criteria, produce false positive rates that are frankly alarming, and whose tests will come back positive in people who have never been anywhere near a Lyme-carrying tick. Their business model depends on creating or confirming a diagnosis of chronic Lyme, a persistent active infection that is not supported by the mainstream medical evidence for the majority of people it gets applied to. The chronic Lyme industry that has grown up around these tests is a multi-million-dollar ecosystem of naturopaths, integrative medicine practitioners, and telehealth companies selling long-term antibiotic regimens, IV drips, and supplement protocols to people who are genuinely suffering and who have been failed by mainstream medicine. That last part is important. These are often people with fibromyalgia, lupus, other autoimmune conditions, chronic fatigue, or post-infectious syndromes who couldn't get a satisfying diagnosis through conventional channels. The chronic Lyme label gives them an answer and a community and a treatment plan. The tragedy is that the treatment they receive is not only unsupported for what actually ails them, it frequently delays appropriate diagnosis and treatment. And the predatory commercial structure behind the testing is designed to exploit exactly the vulnerability that the healthcare system created by not taking their suffering seriously enough. The problem is real. The diagnosis is often not. Story 14. Drinking tons of water does not protect your kidneys unless you have specific conditions. Drink lots of water, it'll flush out your kidneys, is one of those pieces of advice that sounds so reasonable, so wholesome, so obviously sensible that people repeat it without ever questioning it. Hydration is good. Kidneys filter blood. Therefore, drinking more water makes kidneys work better and stay healthier. Clean logic. Wrong conclusion. For the vast majority of people with kidney disease, drinking more water than your thirst demands does not change the course of the disease. Chronic kidney disease is driven by the underlying cause: diabetes, hypertension, genetic conditions, autoimmune disease, and none of those causes are meaningfully affected by hydration above normal levels. Your kidneys are not getting cleaner with more water. They are doing the same filtration job they always do, just with a higher volume of fluid to process. The conditions where aggressive fluid intake actually does matter are specific and well-defined. Kidney stones. High fluid intake genuinely reduces recurrence by diluting the urine and reducing the concentration of stone-forming minerals. ADPKD. Autosomal dominant polycystic kidney disease. There is evidence that high fluid intake can suppress vasopressin, which drives cyst growth. Certain causes of acute kidney injury where volume depletion is a factor. That's a fairly short list. Where the real danger lies is the opposite direction. Deliberate dehydration, not drinking enough to satisfy thirst, especially in hot weather or during illness, is genuinely harmful. It concentrates the urine, increases infection risk, and in vulnerable populations can contribute to acute kidney injury. The actual evidence-based advice is considerably less exciting than the flush your kidneys mythology. Drink when you're thirsty, drink a bit more in hot weather or when exercising, and don't go long stretches without any fluid. Follow your thirst. It's a reasonably well-calibrated system. Story 15. You use way more than 10% of your brain, like all of it. We have covered a lot of medical myths in this thread, but the 10% brain thing deserves its own dedicated entry because it has spawned an entire genre of self-help content, a movie starring Scarlett Johansson, and a level of cultural penetration that is genuinely impressive for something with zero scientific basis. Nobody knows exactly where this originated. One popular theory attributes it to William James, the American psychologist, who wrote in 1907 that humans make use of only a small part of our possible mental and physical resources. He was talking about effort and potential, not literally saying that 90% of your neurons are inactive. Another origin story involves misquotations of Einstein. Another involves misinterpretations of early neuroscience research, in which researchers found that destroying some brain regions did not produce obvious behavioral deficits, which got misread as that area isn't doing anything, rather than we haven't found the right test for what that area does. What we actually know from modern neuroscience is that essentially all of your brain is doing something at all times. Different tasks activate different regions at different intensities. You're not lighting up the motor cortex when you're sitting still and thinking, and you're not running intensive visual processing when your eyes are closed. But over the course of a normal day, all your brain regions are active and contributing. The metabolic evidence alone should settle this. Your brain accounts for approximately 2% of your body weight and consumes approximately 20% of your total caloric intake. Evolution is brutal about energy efficiency. It does not maintain enormous metabolically expensive tissue that isn't pulling its weight. If 90% of your brain weren't doing anything, you would have evolved a much smaller, cheaper brain over millions of generations. The 10% myth is not just scientifically wrong, it's biologically nonsensical. Story 16. Shaving does not make your hair grow back thicker or darker. This is one of those myths that is so universally believed and so persistently transmitted between generations that debunking it feels almost rude. Mothers tell daughters before their first shave. Friends share it in middle school bathrooms. It has the feel of practical wisdom passed down through experience. It is completely untrue. Here's the actual biology. A hair follicle is a structure in the dermis, below the skin surface, that produces the hair shaft. Shaving cuts the hair shaft at skin level or just above it. The follicle is not touched. The follicle is not stimulated. The follicle has no idea you just ran a razor over the hair it produced. The follicle will continue producing exactly the same caliber and color of hair it was producing before because nothing that affects the follicle occurred. What does change is the shape of the hair at its tip. An unshaved hair has a naturally tapered tip. It's thinner at the end than it is at the shaft. When you cut it with a razor, you create a blunt cross-section. When that blunt-tipped hair pushes back through the skin, it feels coarser to the touch than the tapered tip that was there before. It also appears darker, briefly because the blunt tip has more surface area catching light differently than a tapered tip. This is entirely an optical and tactile illusion. The hair is the same thickness. The follicle is unchanged. The regrowth feeling like sandpaper compared to unshaved hair is just geometry. Studies on this go back to 1928 when a researcher conducted a controlled trial measuring hair diameter before and after shaving. No difference. The myth has been disproven for nearly 100 years, and it is still confidently repeated by people who learned it from their mothers, who learned it from their mothers. Myths are very good at surviving contact with evidence. Story 17. The 5-second rule is not real, and germs are not waiting for your permission. The 5-second rule is one of those beliefs that exists in a fun middle space where people kind of know it's not actually true, but repeat it anyway as a semi-ironic justification for eating food off the floor. Except a meaningful number of people genuinely do believe it, which is why it deserves the full treatment. The core claim is that food dropped on the floor is safe to eat if you pick it up within 5 seconds, because bacteria haven't had time to transfer yet. This has been formally tested. Rutgers University published a study in 2016 specifically designed to evaluate it, and the result was what you would expect from anyone who has thought about how bacteria work for 5 seconds. Contamination begins immediately on contact. The amount of contamination that occurs does increase with contact time, so there's a partial grain of truth in the general direction of the rule. Less time on the floor means less contamination than more time on the floor. But less contamination is not no contamination, and the transfer begins at the moment of contact, not at the 1-second mark or the 5-second mark. The type of food matters enormously too. Watermelon picked up at 1 second had more bacteria than gummy bears left for longer, because wet, sugary foods are more efficient vectors for bacterial transfer than dry ones. The type of flooring and how contaminated the floor surface is also matters more than time. A floor that had salmonella-contaminated liquid spilled on it a day ago and was never cleaned is going to transfer bacteria to dropped food, regardless of how quickly you pick it up. The practical upshot: whether you eat the dropped food is ultimately your call and depends heavily on the specific situation. Just don't pretend you have a 5-second window of microbial immunity. You don't. Story 18. Please stop pouring hydrogen peroxide on your wounds. Seriously, stop. The hydrogen peroxide on cuts thing is one of the most persistent medical myths in existence, and it is, mildly, backwards. People reach for the brown bottle in the medicine cabinet when they get a cut because the bubbling seems like it must be doing something, foaming out the infection, killing the germs, cleaning the wound. The bubbling is doing something. It's just not the thing you want it to do. Hydrogen peroxide does have antimicrobial properties. It kills bacteria. It also kills fibroblasts, the cells responsible for wound healing and the formation of new tissue. When you pour hydrogen peroxide on a wound, you are creating a hostile environment for both the bacteria you're worried about and the cells your body is using to fix the damage. You're slowing your own healing. The research on this has been consistent for decades. Hydrogen peroxide has been shown to impair wound healing in multiple studies, and its use on wounds is not recommended by current wound care guidelines in basically any professional context. The American Medical Association and the American Academy of Dermatology have both moved away from recommending it for wound care. What you should actually do with a wound, assuming it's a minor cut that doesn't require medical attention, is rinse it with clean running water. Tap water, not bottled water, not antiseptic solution, just water. Running water physically removes debris and bacteria from the wound. If you want to use a cleaning solution, saline works. Then cover it with a bandage to keep it moist and protected. The wound will heal faster in a moist environment than in a dry one, which is also why the old advice to let wounds air out is backwards. Moist wounds heal better. Clean water. Cover it up. Let your fibroblasts do their job. Story 19. Cancer is not one disease. Sugar doesn't feed it. Specifically, and declining treatment can kill you. There is so much cancer misinformation circulating at any given moment that addressing all of it properly would take a textbook. But let me hit the 3 that come up most often and cause the most harm. First, cancer is not one disease. Cancer is a category. It describes any condition in which cells undergo uncontrolled division and potentially invade other tissues. Breast cancer and pancreatic cancer and leukemia and glioblastoma are as different from each other mechanistically as they are from the flu. They have different causes, different biological drivers, different responses to treatment, different prognoses. A treatment that works for one type may be irrelevant or harmful for another. Talking about cancer as a single thing that can have one cause and one cure is like talking about cars as a single thing when you're trying to diagnose why your transmission is failing. Second, the sugar feeds cancer claim. All cells use glucose. Cancer cells use glucose. Cancer cells also use more glucose than normal cells because they're dividing rapidly. But eating sugar does not selectively feed cancer cells while your normal cells watch. All your cells are using glucose. Cutting sugar out of your diet does not starve your cancer because your body will produce glucose from other sources to maintain blood glucose levels. Where diet does matter for cancer is in obesity. Excess body fat is a genuine cancer risk factor and a pro-inflammatory state. But eating a chocolate bar does not make your tumor grow faster. Third, the timeline thing is real and it kills people. Stage 1 cancer of most types is highly treatable. Stage 4 cancer of most types is not. The window between those stages is months to years, depending on the cancer type. Every month spent trying coffee enemas or miracle supplements instead of oncology consultation is a month of potential tumor growth. I understand why people look for alternatives. The treatments are brutal and the system is imperfect. But the math on delaying conventional treatment is genuinely grim. Story 20. Hydrogen peroxide on wounds, Part 2. I cannot stress this enough. Look, we already covered hydrogen peroxide, but it keeps coming up because people are absolutely devoted to the bubbling. And I get it psychologically. The visual feedback of the foam feels like evidence that something productive is happening. The activity looks like cleaning. The stillness of running water under a tap does not look like anything. Your brain interprets this as evidence that water is not working and hydrogen peroxide is. This is your brain lying to you. The bubbling you see is the decomposition of hydrogen peroxide into water and oxygen gas, catalyzed by an enzyme called catalase that is present in your cells. Your cells are literally breaking down the hydrogen peroxide you poured on them as a defense mechanism. The bubbles are your cells fighting back against the thing you're putting on them. This should feel relevant. Here's what wound healing actually looks like mechanistically. You get a cut. Platelets rush in and form a clot. Inflammatory cells arrive and clean up debris and bacteria. Fibroblasts migrate into the wound and start producing collagen. New blood vessels form. The tissue contracts and the wound closes. This is a coordinated, tightly regulated biological process that takes about 3 days to several weeks, depending on the wound size, and hydrogen peroxide disrupts multiple stages of it. Fibroblasts, the key cells in the healing process, are directly toxic to hydrogen peroxide at concentrations much lower than what's in the bottle in your medicine cabinet. Killing fibroblasts at a wound site is functionally like burning down the construction crew's equipment depot while they're trying to repair your house. The house will still eventually be repaired, but it will take longer and the results will be worse. Clean water, moist dressing. Let the crew work. This has been established science for decades, and somehow half the population still has hydrogen peroxide in their first aid kit with the explicit intention of using it. Story 21. Fluoride in water prevents cavities, and cavities are a bigger deal than people think. Community water fluoridation has been one of the most successful public health interventions in American history, and it has been under sustained attack from people who misread or selectively cite scientific literature about fluoride's effects in ways that don't reflect what the evidence actually shows. The relevant context. Fluoride at the concentrations used in community water fluoridation, typically around 0.7 parts per million in the United States, has been studied extensively for over 75 years. The evidence for its dental benefits is robust and consistent. Communities with fluoridated water have meaningfully lower rates of dental caries than those without. The CDC lists community water fluoridation as one of the 10 great public health achievements of the 20th century. The neurotoxicity claims come from studies conducted primarily in China on populations exposed to fluoride at concentrations several times higher than those used in U.S. water fluoridation, often from naturally occurring fluoride in groundwater at 2 to 10 parts per million rather than the 0.7 parts per million in treated water. Extrapolating those findings to community water fluoridation concentrations is like using studies on alcohol toxicity to argue that drinking water is dangerous. Now here's the thing people underestimate. Early childhood caries is the most common chronic infectious disease of childhood in the United States. More common than asthma. More common than any other chronic childhood condition. Dental caries is not a cosmetic issue. Severe early childhood caries causes pain, eating difficulties, sleep disruption, school absence, developmental problems, and can require hospitalization and general anesthesia for treatment in young children. The communities that have removed fluoride from their water have seen increases in childhood tooth decay. This is not a trivial outcome. The fluoride avoidance movement has real public health consequences, and those consequences are concentrated in children in lower-income communities who have less access to dental care as an alternative. Story 22. On the inside, we all look exactly the same as a radiologist. I read a genuinely staggering number of CT scans, X-rays, MRIs, and ultrasounds. Thousands over a career. And I can tell you with complete confidence that if you showed me a scan without any patient information attached, I could not reliably tell you the race or ethnicity of the person whose insides I was looking at. I can sometimes tell you the gender. There are obvious anatomical differences when the pelvis is included in the field of view, and certain scan protocols are specific to gender-associated anatomy. I can estimate age from bone density, degenerative changes in the joints, and certain tissue characteristics. I can tell you a lot about a person's health status from what I see. What I cannot do, what is simply not possible with current imaging, is look at someone's liver or lungs or kidneys or bones and determine anything about their race or ethnicity. This matters because there is a long history of medicine treating race as a biological category with predictive relevance for internal anatomy, physiology, and disease. Some of this has been used to justify genuinely harmful practices, race-adjusted algorithms in medicine that have been shown to delay or worsen care for Black patients in specific contexts, historical reluctance to study health outcomes across racial groups that led to recommendations being based on predominantly white study populations, the persistence of beliefs about anatomical differences between races that are not supported by modern biology. Race is a social construct with real health implications, because racism causes stress and reduces healthcare access and affects the social determinants of health. It is not a biological category that determines what someone looks like on the inside. Everyone's organs are in the same place. Everyone's bones have the same density for their age and gender. On imaging, the only thing that makes any of us different is what disease has done to us, and disease does not check your ethnicity first. Story 23. There is no safe amount of alcohol. The one glass of wine, research has a major problem. A glass of red wine a day is good for your heart. Claim had a good run. It was in every lifestyle magazine. It was in nutrition guidelines. It was used by millions of people to feel virtuous about their evening drink. It turns out it was almost entirely a product of a methodological error in the research that produced it. The problem is called the sick quitter bias. The early observational studies that found moderate drinkers had better cardiovascular outcomes than non-drinkers compared 3 groups: heavy drinkers, moderate drinkers, and non-drinkers. The non-drinkers looked worse in the data, but the non-drinker category included a substantial proportion of people who used to drink heavily and had stopped because of health problems. Former heavy drinkers who quit for health reasons are not a healthy comparison group. They have the accumulated damage of their previous drinking. When researchers corrected for this by separating lifetime abstainers from former drinkers, the cardiovascular benefit of moderate drinking largely or entirely disappeared. The more recent and more methodologically rigorous evidence is pretty unambiguous. A 2018 Lancet analysis, the most comprehensive meta-analysis on this question to date, concluded that the safest level of alcohol consumption is 0. Any consumption, including light-moderate consumption, was associated with increased overall health risk when all outcomes were included. The cardiovascular signal might be real but small, and it is outweighed by increased risks of cancer, particularly breast cancer, liver disease, accidents, and other outcomes. This doesn't mean a glass of wine is going to kill you. The absolute risk at low levels of consumption is small, but associated with improved health, and probably won't hurt you much, are very different claims, and the first one is no longer well supported. Story 24. Big Pharma isn't keeping you sick, but big food might be. The doctors and pharmaceutical companies want to keep you sick to make money theory has enough surface plausibility that it's genuinely difficult to completely dismiss. And honestly, the history of medicine contains enough examples of financial interests distorting medical practice that skepticism of the industry is not inherently unreasonable. The opioid crisis was partly a pharmaceutical industry-driven disaster. Certain drugs have been kept on the market longer than their risk profile warranted because of commercial incentives. These things happened. But the version of the claim that says oncologists are hiding cancer cures, or that your GP is prescribing statins to make you drug dependent when lifestyle changes would fix everything, or that vaccines are a sickness maintenance scheme, that version requires ignoring some fairly obvious counter-arguments. Doctors get sick. Doctors die of the diseases they treat. Doctors' families die of the diseases they treat. The idea that physicians are collectively sitting on cures for conditions that kill them and their loved ones requires a level of conspiratorial discipline that human beings have demonstrated they cannot maintain for about 5 minutes. The pharmaceutical industry does charge too much for drugs. It does sometimes prioritize profitable treatment over affordable treatment. It does sometimes promote drugs more aggressively than the evidence supports. These are real structural problems worth real policy solutions. Now, big food. The processed food industry has spent decades and billions of dollars funding research that muddies the evidence on the relationship between ultra-processed food and health outcomes, lobbying against nutrition labeling, marketing directly to children, optimizing foods for overconsumption by manipulating salt/fat/sugar ratios, and successfully shifting the conversation about the obesity epidemic toward individual willpower and away from the industrial food environment. The evidence for the health harms of the ultra-processed food supply is robust. The industry's response to that evidence has been a page-for-page copy of the tobacco playbook. If you're looking for industries keeping you sick for profit, you don't have to look as far as your doctor's office. Story 25. You did not personally develop resistance to an antibiotic. This one comes up constantly in clinical settings, and it represents a genuine conceptual misunderstanding of how antibiotic resistance works. A patient will report being allergic to an antibiotic, except it's not an allergy. They took it, and it didn't work for a previous infection. So they concluded that they had developed resistance to it, and it won't work for them anymore. Individual humans do not develop resistance to antibiotics. Antibiotics are drugs that act on bacterial cellular machinery. Bacteria can develop resistance through mutations that alter the target, produce enzymes that inactivate the drug, or develop pumps that remove the drug from the bacterial cell. The resistance is in the bacteria, not in the person. When an antibiotic doesn't work for you, what is almost certainly happening is one of several things. The most common, the infection you had was viral and antibiotics were never going to work on it because antibiotics don't act on viruses. The second most common, the specific bacteria causing your infection, was naturally resistant to that antibiotic because of its specific characteristics, not because of anything you or the bacteria did specifically. Third possibility, you were given the antibiotic for a genuine bacterial infection, but the treatment course was insufficient to clear it. What can happen, and this is where the real resistance concern lives, is that using broad-spectrum antibiotics selectively kills susceptible bacteria in your gut microbiome while leaving resistant strains, temporarily enriching your microbiome for resistance genes. But even this is not the same as you personally becoming resistant to the drug. The drug would still work on susceptible bacteria elsewhere in your body. Antibiotic resistance is a massive and genuinely frightening public health crisis. But it is a population-level phenomenon driven by overuse and misuse of antibiotics across the whole system, not something that happens to individual patients who took amoxicillin too many times. Story 26: Chiropractors and the Evidence Problem. Nobody wants to talk about. This is going to upset some people, but the evidence on chiropractic for most of its claimed applications is, to put it charitably, not strong. Let me be specific rather than just dismissive, because the evidence landscape is more nuanced than chiropractors are totally fake, and more concerning than chiropractic is just another valid treatment option. For acute low back pain, there is moderate evidence that spinal manipulation provides similar benefits to other first-line treatments. NSAIDs, exercise, physical therapy. If you've tried those and you feel better after chiropractic adjustment for back pain, the evidence doesn't suggest you're imagining it. The specific mechanism proposed by chiropractic theory, subluxations of the spine causing organ dysfunction, is not supported by anatomy, and the concept itself is not recognized by mainstream physiology. But something is happening mechanically that appears to provide short-term pain relief in some patients. The concern begins when chiropractic is applied to conditions beyond musculoskeletal pain, when it is positioned as a treatment for ear infections, asthma, fertility problems, or other non-mechanical conditions. For these indications, the evidence is essentially zero, and the theoretical mechanism does not exist. Children being adjusted for ear infections is not treating anything real. The serious safety concern is cervical spinal manipulation, adjustments of the neck. There are documented cases of vertebral artery dissection following cervical manipulation, a stroke mechanism that can be fatal. The absolute risk is debated and probably low, but it is not zero, and for a treatment that is not strongly indicated for most of its common applications, any non-zero risk of stroke is worth a serious conversation. If someone wants to see a chiropractor for back pain and has been evaluated medically to rule out serious pathology, that's a reasonable choice with some evidence behind it. For everything else, the evidence simply isn't there. Story 27. Statins do not cause dementia. Please stop refusing cholesterol medication for this reason. The statin dementia myth has a reasonably clear origin point. In 2012, the FDA added a label warning about statins and cognition following case reports of memory problems in statin users. This generated significant press coverage and gave the claim an apparent official legitimacy that kept it circulating even after the evidence picture became much clearer. Here is what the evidence actually shows. Multiple large prospective studies following tens of thousands of patients over years have found no association between statin use and dementia or cognitive decline. Several studies have found that statin use is associated with reduced risk of dementia, particularly vascular dementia, which makes biological sense, since statins reduce the cardiovascular risk factors that drive small vessel cerebrovascular disease, which is a major contributor to cognitive decline. The 2012 FDA label change was based on spontaneous adverse event reports, the same passive reporting system that generates signals worth investigating, not signals worth treating as proven causal associations. The signals from these reports are substantially confounded. People who are sick enough to need statins are also at higher risk for cognitive decline from their underlying conditions. The temporal association between starting a drug and noticing a health change is not evidence of causation. The practical consequence of the statin dementia myth is that people who need cholesterol management refuse medication and increase their risk of heart attack and stroke. Cardiovascular disease is one of the leading causes of death in the developed world, and statins are among the most effective interventions we have for reducing cardiovascular event risk. Refusing them because of a myth about dementia that the evidence does not support is a trade of a real significant risk for a non-existent one. Your statin is not going to give you dementia. Your untreated hypercholesterolemia might give you a stroke, which can. Story 28. Vitamin C will not prevent your cold. It might shorten it by about a day. The megadosing vitamin C for cold prevention thing really comes from Linus Pauling, a Nobel laureate in chemistry and peace, who became convinced in the 1970s that high-dose vitamin C could prevent colds and potentially treat cancer. Pauling had extraordinary scientific credibility from his actual chemistry work, which gave his vitamin C advocacy a weight it perhaps didn't deserve. The supplements industry has been delighted by his legacy ever since. What does the evidence actually show? The Cochrane Systematic Review on Vitamin C and the Common Cold, which has been updated multiple times and is the most comprehensive synthesis of the evidence, reaches fairly consistent conclusions. For most people taking regular daily vitamin C supplements, there is no meaningful reduction in cold incidence. You're not statistically less likely to get a cold. There is a modest effect on duration, about 8% shorter in adults and about 14% shorter in children, which translates to roughly half a day to 1 day shorter illness. There is also some evidence of symptom severity reduction, but it's weaker. So your cold might be a bit shorter and a bit milder. This is not nothing, but it's also not vitamin C prevents colds. The one population where vitamin C does seem to reduce cold incidence is people under extreme physical stress, marathon runners, soldiers doing heavy winter training. For these individuals, regular supplementation appears to cut cold rates roughly in half. The rest of us are not getting that benefit. There's also no particular evidence that taking vitamin C after you already have a cold does anything useful. The immune system doesn't suddenly get a boost from vitamin C you take on day 2 of symptoms. If there's a protective effect, it comes from consistent baseline levels. The supplements industry will not thank me for saying this. Story 29. There is no such thing as a broken bone versus a fractured bone. They're the same thing. This is a small myth, but a consistent one, and I encounter it in some form almost every shift. A patient comes in with an obvious fracture of the radius on X-ray, and I tell them it's fractured and they want to know if it's broken or just fractured. Or they've been told by someone, often another patient, sometimes unfortunately a lay person they trust, that fractured is less serious than broken, or that a fracture is a crack and a break is a complete separation. None of these distinctions are medically real. Fracture is the correct medical term for any disruption in the continuity of bone. Break means the same thing colloquially, but it's not a clinical term with a specific definition. The severity of a fracture is communicated through a completely different vocabulary. Open versus closed, whether the bone has penetrated the skin, comminuted, shattered into multiple pieces, displaced versus non-displaced, whether the bone ends have moved out of alignment, angulated, compressed, impacted. These terms carry actual clinical information about severity and management. Broken carries no consistent clinical information because people use it to mean everything from the bone is in 30 pieces to there's a hairline crack. When a patient tells me their bone is broken, I still need to get an X-ray and describe the fracture pattern in proper terms, because broken doesn't tell me anything about what I need to do. The fracture is less serious version of this myth occasionally leads people to not seek treatment for fractures they've convinced themselves are just a fracture, not actually broken, which is unfortunate because the words mean the same thing, and some fractures require urgent attention. If a bone is fractured, please go to a doctor. Story 30. The ER cannot diagnose. Most conditions, that is not what ERs are. 4 people come to the emergency department with a reasonable expectation that they will leave with an answer. They've been having symptoms for weeks. They couldn't get a GP appointment. They figured the ER would run all the tests and tell them what's wrong. Then they leave with a discharge summary that says something like abdominal pain, etiology undetermined, follow up with primary care physician. They feel dismissed. They feel like the system failed them. The system did not fail them, or rather, it failed them in a different way than they think. The emergency department's actual job is to determine whether the problem is immediately life-threatening and, if so, to stabilize it. That is the entire mandate. The ER is built for, is this person dying right now? And can I do something about it in the next few hours? It is not built for what has been causing this person's intermittent abdominal discomfort for 6 weeks. Reaching a definitive diagnosis for most chronic or subacute conditions requires time, serial examinations, testing that can't all be done in a single visit, sometimes specialist input, and often watchful waiting to see how the symptoms evolve. An ER visit is a snapshot. Diagnosis is often a film. The ED can tell you whether the snapshot looks catastrophic. It cannot run the whole film in 4 hours. People who leave the ER without a diagnosis are not being failed. They are usually in the situation where their condition is real and significant, but is not an emergency. And the appropriate next step is outpatient workup with a physician who can follow them over time. The problem is that for many patients, that next step is inaccessible or has a 3-month wait, which is what's driving them to the ER in the first place. That's a healthcare system problem. It's not a failure of any individual ER physician. Story 31. Treated does not mean cured, and not being cured is not malpractice. Medicine has a fundamental communication problem around the word treatment. When most people hear that they're being treated for something, they hear a promise. You are being fixed. The treatment will fix it. If the treatment doesn't fix it, something went wrong. If something goes wrong, someone is responsible. This is not how medicine works. And the gap between patient expectation and clinical reality causes an enormous amount of grief and sometimes litigation. Treatment means an intervention directed at a medical problem with the intent to improve outcomes. It does not guarantee success. Every treatment has a failure rate. Every surgery has a complication rate. Every medication has patients for whom it doesn't work or causes side effects that require discontinuing it. A cancer treatment can be correctly indicated, correctly administered, and consistent with the standard of care while still failing to cure the cancer, because the cancer's biology may make it resistant to that treatment. Guarded prognosis and poor prognosis are real clinical categories. They exist because some conditions, even when treated optimally, have high rates of treatment failure, disease progression, or death. A patient with stage 4 pancreatic cancer who receives the best available chemotherapy and dies in 6 months was not failed by anyone. The disease killed them. The treatment took some time. Both of these things can be true. Malpractice is a specific legal and ethical category. It requires deviation from the standard of care. The standard of care is what a reasonably skilled physician with similar training would do in similar circumstances, not what a perfect physician with perfect knowledge in a hypothetical world would do. An outcome being bad is not evidence of malpractice. An outcome being different from what the patient expected is not evidence of malpractice. Medicine is not a guarantee, and it never has been. Story 32. Antibiotics do not work on viruses at all, even if you feel really bad. This one should be fully absorbed into public consciousness by now. And yet every cold and flu season, the prescription pads come out, sometimes because patients demand it, and sometimes because it's easier to write the script than to have the conversation for the fourth time that hour. And the antibiotic resistance crisis gets a little worse. Antibiotics work by targeting specific structures or processes in bacterial cells, the cell wall, the ribosome, DNA replication machinery. Viruses don't have cell walls. Viruses have completely different replication mechanisms. A virus reproduces by hijacking your own cell's machinery, which means attacking it with drugs that target bacterial machinery does nothing. The virus doesn't notice the antibiotic. The antibiotic cannot notice the virus. When you take an antibiotic for a viral infection, what you are doing is killing bacteria in your gut microbiome that were minding their own business and contributing to your health, creating selective pressure for antibiotic-resistant strains in your microbiome, potentially causing side effects including diarrhea and allergic reactions, and contributing to the global antibiotic resistance crisis. You are doing all of this in exchange for absolutely zero benefit against the viral infection you have. The patient who feels terrible with a cold and wants antibiotics is not wrong to want relief. They feel awful and they want help. The problem is that antibiotics are not helpful for what they have. What they need is supportive care, rest, fluids, time, and possibly symptom management with antihistamines, decongestants, or analgesics as appropriate. The cold will run its course in about a week. With antibiotics, it will run its course in about a week. Doctors who prescribe antibiotics for clearly viral infections are not helping their patients. They are helping their patients feel like they receive treatment while contributing to a public health problem that kills people. Story 34. A biopsy does not make cancer. Spread, the air does not touch the tumor. This is a belief that genuinely delays cancer diagnosis and sometimes kills people, so it gets a full treatment. The claim is that performing a biopsy, inserting a needle, or taking a tissue sample from a suspected tumor causes cancer cells to be disturbed or exposed to air, which makes them spread to other parts of the body. Patients refuse biopsies because of this. They refuse recommended surgical procedures. The fear is real, and the consequences are serious. The biological claim does not hold up. Let's start with the air exposure part. Cells in a biopsy are not exposed to open air in any meaningful sense during the procedure. A needle biopsy takes a core of tissue out of the body in a matter of seconds and deposits it in a collection container. The cells are not exposed to air in any way that would affect tumor behavior. More fundamentally, cancer cells need specific biological conditions to metastasize, to travel to a new location, and establish a new tumor colony. They need to survive in the bloodstream, evade immune surveillance, find a suitable site, establish their own blood supply, and successfully proliferate in a new tissue environment. This is actually a very difficult process, and the vast majority of cancer cells that enter the bloodstream do not successfully metastasize. A biopsy is not a magic key that unlocks these capabilities. What the research actually shows is that biopsy does not increase rates of metastasis or worsen cancer prognosis. Multiple studies looking at outcomes in patients who had biopsies versus those who didn't, adjusted for disease stage and other factors, show no evidence of biopsy-caused spread. The small theoretical risk of a few cells being displaced by the needle is vastly outweighed by the clinical necessity of knowing exactly what you're dealing with before deciding on treatment. Please get the biopsy. Story 35. I feel better, so I'll stop my antidepressants. That's not how this works. This might be the most common and most consequential antidepressant myth, and it plays out in psychiatry and primary care practices constantly. The patient starts an antidepressant. The patient starts feeling better over several weeks. The patient concludes they don't need the antidepressant anymore because they feel better. The patient stops medication. Patient relapses. The patient is confused about why they relapsed when they felt so good. The logic is understandable, but it contains a fundamental misunderstanding of what antidepressants do. The antidepressants are not treating the feeling of depression the way a painkiller treats pain, where the symptom is the target, and once the symptom goes away, the treatment has done its job. Antidepressants alter the neurochemical environment that allows your brain to regulate mood, motivation, sleep, and cognitive function. When that environment is stabilized, you can function better. Functioning better creates positive feedback loops. You engage in activities, you maintain relationships, you exercise, you sleep better, you experience things that are intrinsically rewarding. These things make you feel less depressed, which is real improvement. But the underlying vulnerability that required the antidepressant in the first place, whatever combination of neurobiological predisposition, life circumstances, and psychological patterns contributed to the depression, has not been resolved. The medication is the scaffolding. Feeling better is what happens when the scaffolding is in place. Removing the scaffolding because the building looks stable is how you find out the building still needed the scaffolding. The general guidance from psychiatry is that after a first depressive episode, antidepressants should be continued for at least 6 to 12 months after full symptom remission. After multiple episodes, indefinite maintenance therapy is often appropriate. Stopping because you feel better without tapering under medical supervision also carries the risk of discontinuation syndrome, with symptoms including dizziness, nausea, and electric shock sensations. You feel better because the medication is working. That is not the same thing as not needing the medication.